lot of wonderful verses in the Bible. Memorable, comforting, inspiring, and reassuring. Like, say, "The Lord is my shepherd," or "I go to prepare a place for you," or "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son," and so on. But then, there are also a lot of very difficult passages in the Bible. Tough ones, weird ones, harsh ones. But for me, perhaps the strangest verse in the Bible, one in which I throw up my hands and say, I have no idea, comes from 1 Timothy chapter 2. The author says, "Let a woman learn quietly in all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet." Now, a lot of church denominations use this verse, and one or two others like it, to prohibit women from not only being pastors, but also from any type of leadership in the church. Faith Lutheran is not one of those churches and has benefited from the strong leadership and gifts that women provide, including as pastors. Because as we have seen in this series, there are several instances in Scripture where women have led. At the same time, the culture of the ancient Middle East made it difficult for women. Actually, we could say the same thing for the modern Middle East. So women were still forced to lead only through influence behind the scenes. But the strangest part of this verse from 1 Timothy immediately follows. The author continues, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control." Saved through childbearing? Women are saved through childbearing? I have no idea what to do with that verse. It is not consistent with or backed up by anything else in the Old Testament or New Testament. It is just strange. I mean, we understand that we are justified by faith, not by having kids. In the Old Testament times, however, it may have felt like childbearing was salvation. In a time when women did not work, it seemed that their sole purpose was to have children and raise a family. So much of who they were and how they felt about themselves was wrapped up in the ability to have a child. We've already seen the anguish experienced by Sarah and Rebecca and Leah and Rachel as they struggled to have kids. In each case, the joy they experienced when God opened their womb felt like salvation to them. And today, we will meet another woman who experienced the same thing. So welcome to session 6 of our faith group series, Influence and Intrigue, the role of women in Israel's history. Today we're taking a look at Hannah, the mother of Samuel, whose story is found in the beginning of the book 1 Samuel. Chapter 1, verse 1 sets the scene. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephronite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah, something like that. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And therein lied the problem, and the source of Hannah's plight and pain. Hannah was barren. And, in a sense, so was Israel. The story of Hannah and Samuel begins after the chaos of the book of Judges. Throughout Judges, the situation of Israel was spiraling into chaos. Disobedience and immorality led to destruction and atrocities. The people rejected and ignored their leader, the Lord, who had led them out of slavery and given them the promised land. By the end of the book, it says that in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Israel was barren. There was no life there. Israel was lost. 1 Samuel tells us of God's response to Israel's wayward ways, how he would raise up mighty men, some of the strongest leaders in Israel's history: Samuel, Saul, David. But salvation comes, and the story begins with a woman, with Hannah. Commentator Walt Brueggemann puts it like this: in a daring move, back behind the great men, the narrative locates the origin of Israel's future and the source of its great leaders in the story of a bereft, barren woman named Hannah. The story of Israel's waiting that moves from trouble to well-being begins neither in grand theory or in palace splendor, nor in doxological celebration. It begins, rather, in a single Ephraimite family whose father had a solid family pedigree, but whose mother is barren, without children, and without the prospect for children. Our story of waiting begins in barrenness wherein there is no hint of future. Israel's waiting begins as Hannah's waiting begins, in hopelessness. Those who read the narrative are invited to listen and to notice, in the midst of such barren hopelessness, that fruitful waiting, hoping, and receiving indeed can happen. Hannah, as you heard, was not Elkanah's only wife. Peninnah, the other wife, was not very gracious towards Hannah's childless situation. In fact, she liked to rub Hannah's nose into it. Perhaps she was bitter about her ridiculous name. But more likely, it's because it appears Elkanah favored Hannah. 1 Samuel actually describes Peninnah, I have no idea how to pronounce her name, as a rival to Hannah. So it happened that Elkanah took his wives to worship the Lord at Shiloh, a holy city where the tabernacle was set up. And it was there that Hannah stole away for a bit of private prayer, or at least she thought that it was private. It just so happened that Eli, the high priest, was sitting nearby. And so he observed this woman, her lips moving rapidly, with tears streaming down her face and her arms gesturing, waving around. And being the holy man that he was, Eli naturally assumed that Hannah was drunk. But Hannah was not in a drunken stupor, but rather in a desperate prayer. O Lord of hosts, she prayed, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, and remember me, and forget not your servant, but will give to your servant a son, Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. She just wanted a son. So Eli foolishly confronts her. How long are you going to be drunk, he says. Put your wine away from you. But Hannah quickly corrects him. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink. I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. All along, I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. And then Eli, to his credit, and without any insight to what Hannah was actually praying about, declares, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." Well, Hannah immediately feels better. And a few verses later we read, Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. The name Samuel sounds like the Hebrew for heard of God. Well, later, after the child was weaned, Hannah, as promised, brings Samuel back to Shiloh. And there she presents Samuel to the Lord, saying, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. Can you imagine this? This child for whom you prayed, the child whom you wanted all of your life, you finally have him, and then you give him to the Lord. Samuel would live and be raised at Shiloh, away from his mother. I admit, there are times when I've been tempted to send my child away, but in reality, it would be much too painful. But if Hannah was sad, we are not told. Instead of expressing sadness, Hannah expresses exuberance, and she expresses it in song. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, we have Hannah's beautiful song. It's much longer than Miriam's song, which we heard about a couple sessions ago, but it's just as triumphant. And this song, while Hannah's song, is much more than just her song. It is Israel's song. Walt Brueggemann says, the birth is an assertion that concerns the entire community. It is an assertion that the life and future of Israel, like the womb of Hannah, has been reopened. The birth is not a private wonder, but a gift of possibility for all of Israel. Israel must sing with Hannah. And so Hannah opens her mouth to sing. My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Hannah sings of her heart, her horn, her mouth, and her enemies. She sings of God's salvation. And then in verse 2, she declares 3 nones. There is no one like God. Her song then moves into dramatic reversals. There are those who were full, who have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren have borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn, and so on. God has the power to reverse the status quo. so that the weak become strong and the strong become weak. And that's what he's about to do. And finally, she points ahead of her child to the one that he will usher in. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Hannah sings of the horn of David, the great and future king that Samuel will anoint. So Hannah's song becomes Israel's song and really provides a sort of interpretive key for the entire book of 1 Samuel. But Hannah's song also becomes Mary's song. And Mary's song becomes the song of the church. As Israel found hope and futures in the child that Hannah would sing about, so we, as the church, have found hope, deliverance, and a future in the child that Mary sang about. Mary's song, the Magnificat, found in Luke chapter 1, is a sort of echo of Hannah's, with the same exaltation and similar reversals. So Hannah's story is one of life out of barrenness, hope out of despair, deliverance out of lostness. In a very real sense, Hannah was saved through childbearing. And not just Hannah, all of Israel. And even more so, we are saved from a birth of a child. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And that is worth singing about and talking about. So dig into that with your faith groups, and we'll see you in church.